Sarah Martinez had seen enough battlefield trauma in her 3 years as a combat medic to last several lifetimes. The dust-covered medical tent in Afghanistan's Helmand province had become her second home, where she worked tirelessly to patch up wounded soldiers and send them back to their families. Her hands, steady and sure, had saved countless lives, but nothing had prepared her for the case that would challenge everything she knew about medicine and human connection. The morning started like any other in the forward operating base. The desert sun was already blazing at 7 a.m., and Sarah was checking her medical supplies when the radio crackled to life. Incoming wounded. Multiple casualties from Bravo Squad. ETA 5 minutes. The familiar surge of adrenaline kicked in as she and her team prepared the trauma bay. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of sand and diesel fumes. Sarah watched as the stretcher bearers rushed toward her tent, carrying what appeared to be an unconscious soldier. As they brought him closer, she could see he was young, maybe 22 or 23, with short brown hair matted with blood and dust. His uniform was torn and stained, but she could make out his name tape, Rodriguez. "What happened to him?" Sarah asked the squad leader, a grizzled sergeant with worried eyes. "IED blast took out their Humvee. Rodriguez was thrown about 30 feet. He's been unconscious since we found him." "The others?" The sergeant's voice trailed off, and Sarah understood. Rodriguez was the only survivor. As they transferred the soldier to the examination table, Sarah began her initial assessment. His vital signs were stable but concerning. Blood pressure was elevated, heart rate irregular, and his pupils showed signs of severe head trauma. What worried her most was his complete lack of response to any stimuli. She had seen traumatic brain injuries before, but this felt different somehow. "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" she called out while checking his reflexes. "Nothing." She tried again, louder this time, while shining a penlight into his eyes. Still no response. His body lay completely still, breathing steadily but showing no signs of consciousness. Dr. Williams, the senior physician, arrived to assist with the examination. Together, they ran through a comprehensive neurological assessment. The CT scan revealed significant swelling in the brain, but, surprisingly, no major structural damage. It was as if Rodriguez's mind had simply shut down, retreating to some unreachable place. "I've seen this before," Dr. Williams explained to Sarah as they reviewed the scans. "Sometimes when soldiers experience extreme trauma, especially when they lose their entire unit, their mind creates a protective barrier. It's like psychological shock combined with the physical head injury. The brain essentially goes into lockdown mode." Over the next 48 hours, Sarah found herself spending more time with Rodriguez than any other patient. Something about his case bothered her. Despite the severity of his condition, his physical injuries were healing remarkably well. The cuts and bruises were fading, his vital signs were stabilizing, but he remained completely unresponsive. She tried every conventional approach she knew. Loud noises, bright lights, physical stimulation, even playing music through headphones. Rodriguez lay there like he was in the deepest sleep imaginable, his face peaceful but empty. The machines monitored his steady heartbeat and regular breathing, confirming that his body was alive and functioning, but wherever his mind had gone, it seemed impossibly far away. On the third day, Rodriguez's commanding officer, Captain Thompson, arrived at the medical tent. He was a tall, weathered man in his 40s with kind eyes that couldn't hide his concern for his soldier. "How is he, Doc?" Thompson asked, looking down at Rodriguez's still form. "Physically, he's recovering well," Sarah explained. "But, mentally, he's completely unreachable. We've tried everything in our medical arsenal." Sometimes with cases like this, patients can remain in this state for weeks, months, or even longer. Captain Thompson nodded grimly. "Rodriguez is a good kid. Best radio operator I've ever worked with. He and his squad were tight, like brothers. They had their own little language, their own jokes, their own way of doing things. Losing them all like that." He shook his head. "Tell me about his squad," Sarah said, sensing that understanding Rodriguez's relationships might be important. "They called themselves the Nighthawks," Thompson explained. 5 guys who'd been together since basic training. They had this motto, this password they'd use when things got really tough. Hawks fly together was what they'd say. Rodriguez came up with it after they lost a friend in their first deployment. He said it reminded them that no matter what happened, they'd always have each other's backs. As Thompson spoke, Sarah noticed the faintest flicker across Rodriguez's face. It was so subtle she might have imagined it, but something about the captain's words seemed to register somewhere deep in the unconscious soldier's mind. Hawks fly together, Thompson repeated softly, looking directly at Rodriguez. That's what you always said, wasn't it, son? Again, Sarah caught what might have been the slightest movement, a barely perceptible tightening around Rodriguez's eyes. She made a mental note but didn't want to get anyone's hopes up over what could have been her imagination. After Captain Thompson left, Sarah found herself thinking about what he had said. The bond between Rodriguez and his squad members had clearly been profound. They had created their own identity, their own language, their own source of strength. Now Rodriguez was alone, the sole survivor of that brotherhood, and perhaps his mind couldn't accept that reality. That evening, as Sarah finished her rounds, she stopped by Rodriguez's bedside one more time. The tent was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. She pulled up a chair and sat down next to him, something she rarely did with unconscious patients. I don't know if you can hear me, Rodriguez, she said quietly, but I wanted you to know that you're not alone. I know you lost your squad, your brothers, and I can't imagine how that feels. But you're still here, and that means something. They would want you to come back to us. She studied his face in the dim light. He looked so young, so vulnerable. Somewhere inside that unresponsive body was a person dealing with unimaginable loss and trauma. Sarah had always believed that healing involved more than just treating physical symptoms. Sometimes the most important part of medicine was simply being present, offering hope when patients couldn't find it themselves. As she prepared to leave, Sarah found herself thinking about Captain Thompson's words again. Hawks fly together. It had been more than just a motto for Rodriguez's squad, it had been their identity, their promise to each other, their source of courage in impossible situations. And now Rodriguez was the only Hawk left. The next morning brought new casualties from another firefight, and Sarah threw herself into her work. But, throughout the busy day, she found her thoughts returning to Rodriguez. During brief breaks between patients, she would check on him, always hoping to see some sign of improvement, some indication that he was finding his way back from wherever his mind had retreated. By the end of the day, there had been no change. Rodriguez remained in the same peaceful but unreachable state, his body healing while his consciousness remained hidden. Sarah knew that conventional medicine had its limits, especially when dealing with the complex intersection of physical and psychological trauma. As she prepared for another night shift, Sarah decided to research everything she could about cases similar to Rodriguez's. She spent hours reading medical journals and case studies, looking for any unconventional approaches that might help reach him. The more she read, the more convinced she became that Rodriguez's condition wasn't just medical, it was deeply personal, tied to his identity as a member of his squadron and his inability to process their loss. Somewhere in the back of her mind, an idea was beginning to form. It was unconventional, perhaps even unorthodox by medical standards, but Sarah was starting to believe that reaching Rodriguez might require more than medicine. It might require understanding the language of brotherhood that had defined his military experience, the code words and shared meanings that had given his life purpose and direction. Sarah's breakthrough came during her 5th day treating Rodriguez, though she didn't recognize it as such at the time. She had been reading aloud to him from letters his family had sent, hoping that familiar voices translated through her words might penetrate whatever barriers surrounded his consciousness. His sister had written about their childhood dog, his mother about the garden she was planting in his honor, his father about the baseball season Rodriguez was missing. As she read, Sarah noticed that certain phrases seemed to cause the slightest changes in Rodriguez's breathing pattern or facial expression. When she mentioned his father's pride in his military service, his heartbeat quickened slightly. When she read about his squad's commendation for bravery, there was a barely detectable movement of his fingers. But the most significant response came when she inadvertently repeated Captain Thompson's phrase from several days earlier. While discussing Rodriguez's military record with Dr. Williams, she mentioned how close-knit his squad had been, how they had their own motto, "Hawks fly together." This time, the response was unmistakable. Rodriguez's eyes moved rapidly beneath his closed lids, his breathing changed, and his hands clenched slightly. The monitor showed a spike in brain activity that lasted for nearly 30 seconds before returning to the previous steady state. Dr. Williams witnessed it too. "Did you see that? Whatever you just said, it got through to him somehow." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with professional curiosity. It was something about his squad's motto. Captain Thompson mentioned it when he visited. Apparently, they used the phrase "Hawks fly together" as a kind of password or rallying cry. "Try it again," Dr. Williams suggested. Sarah leaned closer to Rodriguez and spoke clearly, "Hawks fly together, Rodriguez. Hawks fly together." The response was immediate and more pronounced. Rodriguez's vital signs spiked, his body tensed, and, for a moment it looked like he might actually open his eyes. But, then, just as quickly, he seemed to sink back into the unreachable state, as if the connection had been too painful to maintain. "There's definitely something there," Dr. Williams observed. "The question is whether we should be trying to push him toward consciousness or allowing him to emerge naturally. Sometimes forced awakening from psychological trauma can be more harmful than helpful." Sarah understood the concern, but she also recognized that they were dealing with something unprecedented in her experience. Rodriguez wasn't just unconscious, he was hiding. His mind had created a refuge from reality, and perhaps the only way to reach him was through the bonds and identity that had defined his military life. Over the following days, Sarah developed what she privately called connection therapy. She began researching Rodriguez's squad extensively, learning everything she could about the 5 men who had served together. She contacted their families, their previous commanding officers, and other soldiers who had served alongside them. What she discovered painted a picture of extraordinary brotherhood. The Nighthawks weren't just a squad, they were a family bound by shared experience, mutual dependence, and genuine affection. They had saved each other's lives multiple times, shared their fears and hopes, and created a microculture within the larger military structure. Rodriguez had been their communications specialist, the one who kept them connected to command and to each other during operations. His role hadn't just been technical, he had been the squad's emotional center, the one who maintained morale and cohesion when things got difficult. Sarah learned that Hawks Fly Together had originated during their first deployment when they lost a fellow soldier named Marcus Williams. Rodriguez had created the phrase as a way of honoring Williams's memory while reinforcing their commitment to protecting each other. It had evolved into much more than a motto, it was a promise, a prayer, and an identity all rolled into one. Armed with this understanding, Sarah began incorporating elements of the squad's shared language and experiences into her treatment approach. She would speak to Rodriguez about specific missions they had completed, inside jokes they had shared, and memories recounted by their families and fellow soldiers. Each reference to his squadron life produced responses, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic. When she mentioned a particular firefight where Rodriguez had saved his squad leader's life, his heart rate increased and his hands moved restlessly. When she talked about a letter his squad mate Johnson had written to his girlfriend, Rodriguez's breathing became irregular for several minutes. The most powerful response came when Sarah played a recording she had obtained from Captain Thompson. It was Rodriguez's voice from a radio transmission during a successful mission 3 months earlier. On the tape, Rodriguez could be heard coordinating air support while under enemy fire, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos around him. At the end of the transmission, he signed off with the squad's traditional phrase, "Nighthawks complete. Hawks fly together." When Rodriguez heard his own voice saying those words, his entire body convulsed. His eyes snapped open for the first time in over a week, staring straight ahead with an expression of confusion and terror. But, within seconds, they closed again, and he retreated back into unconsciousness. Dr. Williams was both encouraged and concerned by these developments. "You're definitely reaching him," he told Sarah, "but we need to be careful. He's experiencing genuine trauma responses to these stimuli. His mind is protecting him from something, and we might be forcing him to confront it before he's ready." Sarah knew the doctor was right, but she also sensed that Rodriguez was trapped rather than protected by his unconscious state. Everything she had learned about him suggested that he was someone who faced challenges head-on, who took responsibility for others, who didn't give up when things got difficult. His current state seemed fundamentally at odds with his personality and character. That night, as Sarah sat by Rodriguez's bedside during the quiet hours of her shift, she made a decision that went beyond standard medical protocol. She was going to try something that could either help him break through or drive him deeper into psychological retreat. She had spent hours thinking about what Rodriguez was experiencing in his hidden mental state. He was the sole survivor of a group that had defined itself by unity and mutual protection. Their motto, "Hawks fly together," had become meaningless because he was now flying alone. Perhaps his mind couldn't accept a reality where he continued to exist while his brothers were gone. But Sarah had learned something important from her research into the squad's history. Hawks Fly Together hadn't originally been about never being separated. It had been about carrying the spirit and memory of fallen comrades forward, about ensuring that the bonds of brotherhood transcended death itself. When Rodriguez had created that phrase after Marcus Williams's death, he hadn't been promising that they would never lose anyone else. He had been promising that they would honor the fallen by continuing to embody the values and courage that had united them. Maybe, Sarah thought, Rodriguez needed to understand that being the lone survivor didn't break the promise of Hawks Fly Together. Maybe it was the ultimate fulfillment of that promise, carrying the memory and spirit of his fallen brothers forward into whatever came next. As she prepared for what she hoped would be her breakthrough attempt, Sarah gathered everything she had learned about Rodriguez and his squad. She had photos, letters, recordings, and stories that painted a complete picture of who these men had been and what they had meant to each other. She had their families' messages, their commanding officers' testimonials, and detailed accounts of their service and sacrifice. Most importantly, she had come to understand the true meaning behind their motto, the deeper philosophy that had sustained them through multiple deployments and dangerous missions. Hawks Fly Together wasn't just about staying alive as a group, it was about maintaining the bonds of brotherhood regardless of what fate threw at them. Sarah believed that Rodriguez was trapped not by medical trauma alone, but by a fundamental misunderstanding of what his survival meant. He saw himself as the broken remnant of something that no longer existed, when in fact he might be the living embodiment of everything his squad had stood for. Tomorrow, she would attempt to communicate this understanding to him directly. She would use not just the password his squad had shared, but the deeper meaning behind it. She would try to help Rodriguez see that his survival wasn't a betrayal of his fallen brothers, but a continuation of their mission by other means. The 8th day of Rodriguez's unconscious state dawned clear and hot, typical for the Afghan desert. Sarah had barely slept, spending most of the night preparing for what she hoped would be her most important medical intervention ever. She had arranged for privacy in the medical tent, ensuring that she and Rodriguez would be undisturbed for at least 2 hours. As she approached his bedside that morning, Sarah carried with her a carefully assembled collection of items she had gathered over the past several days. Photos of Rodriguez's squad, letters from their families, recordings of their voices, and detailed accounts of their service together. But, most importantly, she carried a new understanding of what Hawks Fly Together really meant. "Good morning, Rodriguez," she said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I know you can hear me somewhere in there, and I know you're scared to come back. I understand why. But I think there's something you need to know about your squad, about what you meant to each other, and about what it means to be the one who survived." She began by talking about Marcus Williams, the soldier whose death had inspired Rodriguez to create the Hawks Fly Together motto. Through her research, Sarah had learned that Williams had been more than just a squad mate, he had been Rodriguez's closest friend, a young man from Texas with dreams of becoming a teacher after his military service. When Marcus died in that roadside bombing 3 years ago, Sarah continued, "You didn't give up. You didn't retreat into yourself. You created something powerful to honor his memory and protect the brothers you had left. You turned grief into strength, loss into purpose. That's who you are, Rodriguez. That's who you've always been." As she spoke, Sarah noticed the familiar signs of Rodriguez's subconscious response. His breathing became irregular, his hands moved slightly, and the monitors showed increased brain activity. But, this time, instead of backing away from the stimulation, she pressed forward. "I've talked to Captain Thompson, to your families, to soldiers who served with the Night Hawks," she said. "Do you know what they all tell me? They tell me that you were the heart of that squad. You weren't just their radio operator, you were their emotional center, the one who kept them together when things got bad, the one who reminded them what they were fighting for." She pulled out a letter from Rodriguez's mother that she had saved for this moment. "Your mom wrote something I want you to hear. She said, Miguel always took care of everyone else. Even as a little boy, he would bring home stray animals, stand up for kids being bullied, make sure everyone felt included. When he became a soldier, I knew he would find a way to take care of his unit the same way he had always taken care of everyone around him." Rodriguez's vital signs spiked higher than Sarah had ever seen them. His body tensed as if he was fighting against invisible restraints. She could see his eyes moving rapidly beneath his closed lids, and, for a moment she worried that she was pushing him too hard. But, something in his posture told her that this wasn't retreat, this was struggle, the kind of internal battle that had to be fought to reach the other side. "The night before your last mission," Sarah continued, "Johnson wrote a letter to his girlfriend. Captain Thompson showed it to me. Johnson wrote, Rodriguez keeps telling us that hawks fly together, and I finally understand what he means. It's not about never losing anyone. It's about carrying each other forward no matter what happens. If something happens to me, I know Rodriguez and the others will make sure that the best parts of who I am keep flying." The words hit Rodriguez like electricity. His entire body convulsed, and his eyes snapped open, staring directly at the ceiling with an expression of raw anguish. But, this time, instead of closing them again, he turned his head slightly towards Sarah's voice. "Johnson understood, Rodriguez. They all understood. Hawks fly together doesn't mean never being separated. It means that the bonds between you are stronger than death, stronger than loss, stronger than whatever tries to break them apart." Rodriguez's mouth moved slightly, and Sarah heard the faintest whisper, "They're gone." "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "They're gone. But you're not, and that's not an accident. You survived for a reason. Maybe it's so their families can hear their stories one more time. Maybe it's so their memory gets the honor it deserves. Maybe it's so you can teach other soldiers what real brotherhood looks like." Tears began flowing down Rodriguez's cheeks, the first emotion he had shown since arriving at the medical tent. His breathing became ragged, and Sarah could see him fighting to stay present instead of retreating back into unconsciousness. "I was supposed to protect them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You did protect them," Sarah replied. "For 3 years, you kept that squad together. You saved their lives more times than anyone can count. You gave them something to believe in when everything around them was falling apart. The fact that you couldn't save them from an IED that none of you saw coming doesn't erase all the times you did save them." Rodriguez struggled to focus on her face. His eyes were filled with pain, but also with something Sarah hadn't seen before: recognition, connection, the beginning of a return to the present moment. "Hawks fly together," Sarah said softly. "That was never just about the 5 of you staying alive. It was about the spirit you shared, the values you lived by, the way you took care of each other. And, Rodriguez, that doesn't die just because their bodies did. That lives on in you." For the first time since the explosion, Rodriguez spoke in a clear, audible voice. "How do I fly without them?" It was the question Sarah had been preparing for, the heart of his psychological imprisonment. "The same way you flew with them," she answered. "With courage, with honor, with the determination to protect and serve others. Your squad didn't make you brave, Rodriguez. You brought your own courage to the squad, and that courage is still here." She reached for a photo she had prepared, showing all 5 members of the Night Hawks during a lighter moment between missions. They were laughing at something off camera, their arms around each other's shoulders, looking like the young men they were beneath their military bearing. "Look at this picture," Sarah said, holding it where Rodriguez could see. "Look at their faces. Do these look like men who would want their brother to give up because they couldn't continue the mission? Do they look like people who would want you to stop living because they had to stop?" Rodriguez stared at the photo for a long time, his tears flowing freely. Sarah could see him processing not just the image, but everything she had been telling him over the past hour. She could almost feel the mental barriers beginning to dissolve as he allowed himself to remember not just the trauma of losing his squad, but the joy and purpose they had shared. "Johnson used to say I worried too much about everyone," Rodriguez whispered. "He said I needed to trust that people could take care of themselves." "Smart man," Sarah replied. "Maybe it's time to start taking his advice." For the next several minutes, Rodriguez simply lay there, looking at the photo and working through thoughts and emotions that had been locked away for over a week. Sarah stayed quiet, recognizing that he needed space to process everything he was feeling. Finally, Rodriguez looked directly at her. "What happens now?" "Now you start healing," Sarah said. "Not just your body, but your heart and your mind. You start figuring out what it means to be a hawk who flies solo for a while. You start thinking about how to honor your squad's memory by living the kind of life they would be proud of." Rodriguez nodded slowly, then asked a question that made Sarah smile. "Can I call their families?" "I want to tell them. I want them to know what their sons meant to us." "I think that would be exactly what hawks do," Sarah replied. "They take care of their own, even when their own includes people they've never met." Over the following days, Rodriguez's recovery was remarkable. The physical healing accelerated once his mind began processing the trauma constructively. But, more importantly, he began to rebuild his sense of purpose and identity. He spent hours on the phone with his squad mates' families, sharing memories and stories that helped everyone involved begin their own healing process. 3 weeks after awakening, Rodriguez was medically cleared to return home. As Sarah prepared his discharge papers, he pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I need you to know something," he said. "When I was unconscious, I could hear you sometimes. Not words exactly, but I could feel that someone was trying to reach me. At first, I didn't want to come back because coming back meant accepting that they were really gone. But you helped me understand that coming back was the only way to keep them alive." Sarah felt tears in her own eyes as she replied, "You saved yourself, Rodriguez. I just reminded you who you really are." As his transport helicopter lifted off from the base, Sarah watched from the medical tent entrance. Rodriguez waved from the window, and she could see him speaking into his radio headset. Later, Captain Thompson told her what Rodriguez had said as the helicopter cleared the base perimeter. "Nighthawks departing. Hawks fly together." Sarah never saw Rodriguez again, but she heard about him over the years. He returned to civilian life, became a paramedic, and eventually started a support group for military survivors of unit casualties. He spoke frequently at military bases about trauma recovery and the importance of seeking help when struggling with loss. The password "Hawks Fly Together" became more than just a memory for Rodriguez. It became a philosophy of living that he shared with countless others who were struggling to find meaning after devastating loss. And, in Sarah's medical career, Rodriguez's case became a defining example of how healing sometimes requires more than medicine. It requires understanding the language of human connection and the courage to speak it when conventional treatment fails. Years later, Sarah would tell medical students that the most important tool in their arsenal wasn't any instrument or medication, it was the ability to recognize what made each patient fundamentally human, and to use that recognition as a bridge back to life and hope.